Okay, this video is going to cover the first part of the first unit of the U.S. History course called Laying the Foundation. It's going to cover some of the things that you talked about in 8th grade U.S. History. Things like the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Next, I'll talk about the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote this document, incorporating many of the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke's principles into the document. These principles included the idea of limited government, the right to rebel against an ineffective government, and the opportunity to pursue the natural rights enjoyed by all mankind. The Declaration drafted by Jefferson also listed specific complaints against King George III's government that justified the revolution. The first paragraph is going to explain the purpose of the document, to explain why the 13 American colonies are breaking away from Great Britain. The second paragraph outlines the natural unalienable rights, which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson explains that these rights cannot be taken away by the government because they are given to us by God. The third paragraph explains the concept of consent of the governed, that people give the government the right to rule. If the government doesn't do its job, then it can be replaced. The Declaration of Independence was a statement adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776, announcing that the 13 colonies who were already at war with Britain were going to become independent. They will form a new nation, the United States of America. The U.S. Constitution was created in 1787 to replace the Articles of Confederation, the first official government of the United States. It establishes a stronger, three-branch national government with more powers than its predecessor. It was developed because the Articles proved unable to govern the new country properly. Article 1 of the Constitution establishes the legislative branch known as the U.S. Congress. It created a bicameral or two-house legislature, which includes the House of Representatives and the Senate. It also outlines the requirements for serving in either house. Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the executive branch, or the presidency. It explains the powers given to the president and the requirements for serving in that office. Article 3 of the Constitution establishes the judicial branch. It explains that a Supreme Court will be established and that Congress will create lower courts. This document has become the model on which many nations will create governments in the future. If you look on our money, you see the phrase e pluribus unum. It means out of many, one. Traditionally, the understood meaning of the phrase was that out of many states or colonies emerged a single nation. However, in recent years, its meaning has become to suggest that out of many peoples, races, religions, and ancestries has emerged a single people and nation, illustrating the concept of the melting pot. There are 6 main constitutional principles that are important for you to understand in order to learn about the Constitution. The first of which is called popular sovereignty. If you break down the term, popular means the people, and sovereignty means rule. So popular sovereignty means rule of the people. There are 2 main ways that the people can rule a government. One is called direct democracy, and the other is representative democracy. In a direct democracy, citizens vote directly for or against laws. An example on our campus would be when we vote for homecoming. We vote directly. This would be difficult to do in our country since we have over 320 million people. So what we use is a representative democracy where we elect representatives to make laws on our behalf. That is a much easier system to do in a large country like ours. The second constitutional principle that you need to know is called federalism. This is where the powers of the government are split between the federal, state, and local governments. This has essentially been created by the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says the power is not delegated to the United States government by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states, respectively, or to the people. So anything not written in the Constitution is actually set aside for state and local governments to do. If you look at the Venn diagram on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll notice that the national government has powers like maintaining the military, declaring war. The state on the right-hand side of the Venn diagram can set up schools, maintain regulations for marriage, In the middle, they have powers that they share, like collecting taxes and establishing courts. These are important to understand that states and national government have different powers, and they also share some powers. This is the concept known as federalism. One of the most important constitutional principles is the idea of separation of powers. The founding fathers were worried about one person gaining too much power, so they split the powers of the government into three parts. The legislative branch, or Congress, is in charge of making laws, approving presidential appointments. The numbers in Congress are based upon population, as well as the Senate having equal representation. The executive branch, the president, is in charge of signing laws, vetoing laws, pardoning people, and appointing judges. The judicial branch of the Supreme Court is there to interpret laws um, and make sure that the branches of the government are doing their job. One of the most important jobs of the Supreme Court is judicial review. Judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. How this happens is that someone has to challenge a law in court, and the challenge has to go all the way up to the top, and the Supreme Court can decide if a law violates the Constitution. We will talk about several examples of this throughout the year in which laws are struck down by the Supreme Court. A very important constitutional principle is the idea of checks and balances. The founding fathers were concerned that one of the branches may become too powerful, so they made sure that the branches had the ability to stop the other ones. Looking at the chart on the left-hand side, you can see that the branches have powers to stop the other ones. Important ones including the president vetoing congressional legislation. The president can appoint judges. The Supreme Court can declare acts of the president and Congress unconstitutional. And the legislative branch can impeach the president or a judge. The last constitutional principle you need to know is the concept of limited government. The Constitution creates a government that is very limited. The founding fathers feared democracy. They saw democracy as mob rule that could lead to anarchy. They were afraid that the idea of democracy would cause problems in the future. So they created a powerful government, but a government that's limited. Thomas Jefferson famously said, "A government big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything you have." Our government is severely restricted by the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights is a collective name for the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Proposed to calm the fears of the Anti-Federalists who had opposed constitutional ratification, they created these amendments to protect the individual rights and limit the powers of the national government. If you look at the list on the slide, Amendments 1, 2, and 3 deal with individual rights. Most people know Amendments 1 and 2. They're very, very important. The green collection are limits on the government. These have to do with illegal searches and seizures, the rights of people who are accused of crimes. These are all limits on the federal government. The 9th and 10th Amendments deal with states' rights. Why was it necessary to place these provisions in the Constitution? They wanted to make the Constitution able to adjust to the changing times, hundreds of years in the future. How many amendments do we have today? We have 27 total amendments. In 1831, a Frenchman by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville received permission to travel to the United States to study the U.S. prison system. As he traveled through the United States, he wrote a book called Democracy in America. He wrote about the New World and its burgeoning democratic order. He observed that the market revolution, westward expansion, and Jacksonian democracy transformed the fabric of American life. The purpose of writing this book was to show the fading aristocracy and the emerging democratic order. He saw democracy as an equation that balanced liberty and equality. He created what we call 5 values. Number 1, liberty. He said that in the United States we had individual freedoms that other countries did not have. Number 2, individualism. The self-worth of the individual in society, that our society is based upon the ideas of the individual and not the collective people. Number 3 is populism, the idea that the United States doesn't have social classes and that the common man is really in charge of the nation. Number 4 is the idea of laissez-faire, hands-off, that the government does not interfere in business or the economy. And then finally, egalitarianism. This is basically the idea of equality, that most Americans are on an equal playing field and have the same rights and attributes. The last thing I want to cover is the farewell address given by President George Washington. In 1796, as his second term in office drew to a close, President George Washington chose not to seek re-election. Mindful of the precedent his conduct set for future presidents, Washington feared that if he were to die while in office, Americans would view the presidency as a lifetime appointment. Instead, he decided to step down from power, providing the standard of a two-term limit that would eventually be protected in the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. Washington expressed in his farewell address what he hoped would serve as a guiding principle for the young country. First, he stressed the importance of a national union to create happiness for U.S. citizens. He argued that patriotism should be more important than local factors, which could destroy the nation. Second, he explains two other threats to the nation, one domestic, one foreign. Washington warned that political parties were dangerous because they allowed a minority to control the will of the nation instead of the people as a whole. The foreign threat was permanent alliances with European powers, which could pull the United States into war. That's the end of the video. Go ahead and move on to the next assignment.